Hi, I'm Randy MacLean, the president of Waypoint Analytics. I'm Margaret Reynolds, principal of Breakthrough Masters. Margaret does a lot of work with different executive teams, helping them understand how to innovate, how to set strategy in a new way, how to take their companies out of the middle of the pack and take them to the front of the pack by having new thinking, bringing new ideas into what they do. So thank you very much for coming and spending some time with us today in the studio. In this video, we want to talk about thinking outside the box, driving change, and how these things all fit together, and some things that every executive needs to know, needs to be thinking about in order to take their company to the forefront. So, Margaret, we often talk about strategy. Everybody thinks that they have a strategy, but in my experience, what they consider to be a strategy and what the most impactful and successful people consider a strategy are not the same thing. So let's talk a little bit about strategy and strategic execution. I think maybe one of the best places we could start is the 4-quadrant thing that you share with your clients, talking about strategic importance and strategic execution.
Okay.
So can you describe that 4-quadrant box to us? And when we're looking at what are we seeing here on the 2 dimensions of your
Sure.
quadrant?
So the process that I use believes strongly that every organization has to be relevant to the marketplace it serves, and you can only be successful if you really understand the marketplace. So there are really 2 disciplines that are required for successful strategic growth of an organization and the impact that has on profitability, and that is you've got to have a very good strategy, and you've got to be able to implement that strategy.
So when you're looking at your 4 quadrants here, having a strategy or not having a strategy, that's the horizontal.
That would be the
chart.
horizontal axis, correct?
Yeah, and then the vertical axis is what?
The ability to implement, the ability to be an effective change leader, and to ensure that people have understanding of where you're going and what they need to do to help you get there.
All right, so the lower left box is where you have no strategy and no execution.
That's an X, that's a red X, you don't want to be there.
All right, okay, and then so what are the other 2 important boxes that people would see from this chart?
So we have a quiz that we ask teams to take, CEOs and their teams, and say, okay, answer these 10 questions, and it will place you in one of these quadrants. And the upper left quadrant is called the project manager. They are really good at execution. Give them a bone and they will deal with it very effectively.
Yeah.
But they don't necessarily have the strategy. What they have is a list of projects or initiatives, and they're doing a great job at continuous improvement. And I'm not saying that that's not important. It's very important.
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily move the needle for the future. It doesn't take them toward a bigger goal. It doesn't take them to a whole nother level. It tends to be incremental in nature.
Yeah, so that's what we see in this upper left-hand corner here. Project managers, where they're really good at getting things done, but don't really have a good vision for the future or good strategy to work towards.
And to be honest, I would say the vast majority of leaders fall into that category.
Yeah.
They got where they are because they were good at what they did.
Yeah.
And so now they're having to take a step back and realize they have this adjacent responsibility to be great leaders for where we're going in the future as well.
Well, and in fact, that's quite true. We see that fairly frequently, where people are good at getting things done, but they get frustrated eventually because they can't move forward very quickly because they haven't added in a necessary skill, and that's what I call the vision thing, where they can imagine things being done differently and better for their customers, for their companies, and for their own financial performance.
Right.
So what's the other box that's really important here?
Okay, I want to answer that, but the key symptoms of if you're a project manager, just so that you know, is are the initiatives that you've got on your list getting you significant value return? Because the statistics are that only 1 out of 4 is actually returning value to most companies, and that's not a good result. So if you find that kind of thing happening, that's an indicator that you're probably in the project management box. The other box is if you're over here in the lower right. That says you've got a strategy, you're a good visionary thinker, you have determined where you think the company ought to go, but you're maybe not as effective at project management, which means I call that the merry-go-round.
Right.
Because you've got the ideas and you put them out there, but then they just kind of keep circling about, well, how should we do it? We could do it this way. Well, let's not do that. Let's change it and do it this way. And you don't really have the effective ability to move it forward.
And get strategy du jour and
Exactly.
yeah, and nothing ever gets any traction. So what's the ideal?
Well, the ideal is you want to make sure that you have an effective plan for the future,
Yes.
your strategy, and then you want to be able to do what I call strategically engineer the company to accomplish that strategy.
Yes.
So it's about putting the performance against the directive of getting where you're trying to take the organization.
Okay, so that's, I quite understand that, and I actually like the way it's been crystallized in this way because it helps me put some, understand that there's two dimensions that I need to be competent at if I want to lead the company into a bright and better future than the competition. But in terms of getting there, there's some things about strategy that I think are very important. And they, for me, they've always been kind of touchstones or checkpoints that I can use to make sure that we're moving in the right direction. And the first thing is some wisdom that came from Jonathan Burns at MIT, and he said that you don't have a strategy if you're not saying no to anything. And that's so true because I've run into many executives, and they are talking about how they do this so well and that so well, and they do this other thing, and there was this customer that wanted this thing, and they do that too. And I started to realize this, they don't really have a strategy. They're just trying to do a little bit of everything as best they can. Mm-hmm. And that's pretty much what most people will do if they're undisciplined in their approach. And it never leads to good performance because you can't be focused enough to get really good at something that matters in that sense. So so always when I'm thinking about strategy, I'm thinking, okay, what things, it's not just what you do, it's what you don't do. And what things are we saying no to? What kinds of things have we decided that we're not in the business for? And how do we keep ourselves from being dragged down into tar babies that don't actually drive the company forward? Because we take resources and focus away from things that would drive the company forward. So I think that was important. And then one of the other things that is hard for executives is that you can't get a different result by doing the same thing.
That's right.
And many companies think that, or many leaders unfortunately think that the way to take the company forward is just get better at all the things that they do right now. And at best you wind up tweaking around the edges of what you have, and at worst you wind up putting a lot of resources and focus on things that basically don't produce any kind of a new result for the company at all. And so when you're working with people, how do you help them understand the importance of change and keep themselves out of these pits that can really consume their time and energy to the detriment of their leadership?
So two important parts to this answer. The first is making sure they do understand what strategy is. Mm-hmm. And strategy it's important. If you don't have a good strategy, you can't say no to anything, so you're right about that. Mm-hmm. But there's other elements too. One is, I think it's very important that it be externally oriented. What I mean by that is, it's got to be relevant to the market. It can't just be, we're going to be a $10 million company, mm-hmm. or we want to start selling this kind of customer, because you may or may not be able to do that. The market may not give you permission, or the market may not want that.
Yes.
So it's got to be relevant to the market. The other piece about strategy is it's got to be a watershed decision-making tool. In other words, to your point, we do things because they fit our strategy, and we don't do the things that don't fit our strategy. So it has to be clear enough that we can use it that way. Because if it's too generalized, we want to be the leader in our industry. We want to have the best customer service. It's really hard for someone to say, well, what is that exactly? What does that look like? So we have to have enough clarity in our strategy that it can actually help us make decisions. And then the last thing is that we tend to under-resource strategy. So strategy can be how you spend your money. Mm-hmm. And I can sometimes look at a P&L statement and look where they're investing, and someone may say, oh, we're excellent at customer service, but they spend no money on training.
Right.
So there's definitely a disconnect
How can that be true? Yeah.
there. So there's a lot of things that are very important in defining strategy, and if you have some of those elements, you probably have a pretty good idea that you have a good strategy. Mm-hmm. So then the second question becomes, how do you get people prepared to embrace the idea of developing a strategy and actually letting go of some of those things? Because the problem with that is to get them to say, yes, we're going to do this, and no, we're not, that means that they're leaving money on the table, they think.
Mm-hmm.
But what actually happens is when you can have more focus, it's more like the flywheel concept.
Mm-hmm.
If I can be really good at this thing, I can actually overwhelm my customers with their satisfaction, get more customers in the door, make them happier, and keep reproducing that impact. But if I try to be really good at a whole bunch of things, I'm probably only moderately good at most of them and only barely satisfying them. I set myself up to be picked off by my competitors. I set myself up for investing more money in my business to have to make all those different things happen, and I end up being a lot less successful.
I'm worried that as we're speaking, we might be conveying the idea that continuous improvement on what we're doing might be a productive place to be, and I'm not entirely sure that. In fact, I'm pretty convinced that the big leaps forward don't come from incrementally improving our warehouse or our transportation. They really come from having a big idea to enter a new market or do things in a totally different way.
Yeah, I'd like to believe that your strategy is an enabler to take your business to the next stage.
Yeah.
You know, if you've seen the pattern of growth of your company as it's evolved from, you know, its infancy all the way through, this really ought to be able to jumpstart you to a whole different level and to think big enough about your opportunities to really drive that kind of thinking.
I haven't met anybody yet that is so innovative and so intelligent or has that they has whatever it takes to be able to invent every new idea. One of the things I see in very, very skilled managers is an ability to adopt ideas from elsewhere.
Absolutely.
And recognize things that are done in other industries, other markets, and within the market. And so, as a source of new ideas, I'm convinced that every successful and capable leader has to have a disciplined process to continually discover and evaluate ideas from somewhere else. So what are some of the things that you advise your clients in order to get a source of new ideas for their companies?
Because every organization has what I call business gravity, right? They are so rooted in how things are done.
Yes.
Without even always knowing why they were done that way. They
Right.
inherited that. And they were done that way for a reason in a different time. And now there's been evolution and they may not make as much sense. So we have to really, first of all, just admit that we do have business gravity.
Mm-hmm.
So that's step one. We've got to admit that there are things pulling at us that keep us where we are. The second thing is we need to purposefully be studying information that's out there and available to us. So I like to encourage clients to focus on data, not antidotes or even past experience, because that experience could be part of the business gravity.
Yes.
The third part, that data, I really like to focus on a couple of key things. Customers.
Mm-hmm.
What are customers really saying? What are customers' needs that aren't being met? What customers are your best customers from a profitability point of view?
Mm-hmm.
Where is your growth opportunity in this network of customers? I think that's hugely important to understand.
Mm-hmm.
I like them to focus on competitors. I like them to know a lot about their competitors.
Mm-hmm.
I do not like them to imitate their competitors.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I want them to be different than their competitors, because if they can't claim a point of difference, then
Yeah.
it becomes a competition on price.
Yeah.
And that is not usually what most
It's
companies
a race
are
to the
looking
bottom.
for.
Yeah.
So it's very important that you really understand your competitors, and not the way you see them, not as those dirty dogs that you're fighting for business with,
Right.
but rather the way your customer sees them, which maybe is a very reputable company that offers something very similar to you.
Yeah.
And that's very important to understand. And so it's about gathering data, and then of course talking to peers, other people who may do what you do in a different market, or being part of a Vistage group, or coming to conferences like yours are
Right.
a great way to talk
Right.
to peers. Or hiring someone like me who comes in and challenges their thinking and shows them how to take the data they already have and look at it with a fresh eye to see things they haven't observed before.
Yeah, that's a good point. At the very minimum, I think that every executive should be looking at challenging what they do. Why do we do it this way? Does it still make sense? Is there a better way than the way that we've always done it? Because, as you say, the gravitational pull of your history will keep you doing the same thing.
Absolutely.
And your organization is organized to keep things the same. The second thing that came out of what you just spoke for me was that sometimes when you hire somebody from another company, from another place, in another industry, you have somebody come in and will say, well, I've seen this done better or differently somewhere else. Well,
Exactly.
how, we could maybe change this to do it and to make it even better than it is now. And then the third thing is, rather than hiring somebody, you can rent some expertise by having someone like yourself come in and spend some time bringing what you've seen that has worked and has not worked in many different companies and many different industries. And that can open up a lot of avenues very quickly, to have a hired gun come in to help to bring a different perspective from outside, can point out the things that that could change for the better, and to give you and your team something to work on.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
There sometimes brings companies discomfort to think about hiring someone who is not an expert in their industry. And I think that that's very valid when it comes to operational performance improvement, when you want to benchmark logistics or how much I'm spending on this particular function against others in my industry. But when it gets to things like strategy or new ideas or innovation or breakthrough, sometimes it's better to not be as focused on what we have been doing or what our peer group is doing, and rather what's possible, what the potential is.
I find there's a certain amount of timidity on some of these things that holds people back and prevents them from being able to meet their potential. They're so worried about getting it right and being precise and having it all validated that they lose the benefit of that entrepreneurial part that says, hey, there's something we should try this. And if it doesn't work, it's not the end of the world. We can always, backtrack. But that conservatism can really prevent a company from being able to move forward. I want to thank you very much. This has been a really interesting discussion.
Thank you.
I hope this is something that you'll benefit from, and I hope there's some things that you've heard in this video that you might think about that will work for your own company and help you launch your organization up to the next level.